Michael Calabria, and I'm the Director of Arab and Islamic Studies at St. Bonaventure University in the United States. I'm very happy to welcome you this morning for our session on mysticism and peacemaking. Wherever you are, I pray that you and your families are well and safe. I'm coming to you from Canandaigua, New York, in north central New York State in the United States, where I happen to be on retreat with the community of Franciscan friars, of which I am part. They're in a nearby room discussing Pope Francis's encyclical Fratelli Tutti, in which he articulated his vision for universal brotherhood and sisterhood, a topic reflected well by the papers presented at the conference and indeed in this session. We have three fine presenters this morning. I'm really looking forward to hearing from them. Abstracts of their papers and their biographical information is available on the conference website, so I invite you to avail yourself of that. Each presenter will have between 15 and 20 minutes to present. I do ask that each presenter strictly adheres to that schedule, so that all presenters have time to present and that we have enough time for questions afterwards. After the three presenters give their papers, then we will take your questions. For convenience, I ask that during the question period, you submit your questions directly to the presenter using the chat feature. Please do that after all of the presentations. I fear that if you submit your questions during their presentation, it could be potentially distracting. So without further ado, I'd like to begin with Dr. June Ann Greeley, the Director of Middle Eastern Studies at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut in the United States, who will be presenting on Abu Hamid al-Ghazali on the duties of brotherhood as a modern guide for peaceful coexistence. So thank you, Dr. Greeley.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. As I said, this is my first time at this wonderful conference. I don't know how I missed it, or maybe it's just a question of it was just on the radar. So I'm going to be sharing with you my paper. Because of time, I'm going to be cutting away some of what was originally there. So if there are any questions based on perhaps what I cut away, hopefully we'll be able to have a nice conversation. And so I'll just begin. Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali was, as probably you all know, an extraordinary scholar, philosopher, and spiritual teacher of Islam. Generations of Islamic scholars have regarded him as one of the greatest thinkers and have bestowed upon him the honorific proof of Islam, meaning that he was proof of the righteous truth of Islam due to the excellence of his own witness to the faith, the depth of his wisdom, the vibrancy of his spirituality, the creative integration of dogmatic with mystical strains of piety, and the breadth of his knowledge. In addition, in his own time, leading scholars in other faiths read and discussed his works, notably the medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides and the medieval scholastic doctor of the Catholic Church, Thomas Aquinas. Some of his ideas likely found his way into the scholarly as well as spiritual discourse of medieval Judaism and Christianity. And just in full transparency, I'm a medievalist by training and I work in the scholastic tradition. Al-Ghazali is more, however, than a historical figure or religious scholar, limited only to a singular time and singular faith. I would argue his ideas are still relevant today and resonate with all belief communities, as this essay hopefully will demonstrate, with an analysis of his short treatise on the duties of brotherhood, book 15 from the second quarter of his great work, The Revival of Religious Sciences. The analysis will focus on the meaning of companionship and ethical behavior, which al-Ghazali describes in the treatise, both first as a devout Muslim for other Muslims, obviously, especially for those who are sympathetic towards his spiritual inclination towards Sufism. Yet the essay will also address the universality and timelessness of the work by identifying al-Ghazali's discussion of fellowship as a kind of ethics of care, similar to ideas of many modern spiritual teachers from a range of religious traditions. It is the effort of this paper to demonstrate the relevance of Ghazali in contemporary culture through an examination of the spiritual and ethical tenets of his teaching, And the essay will maintain that that the work offers modern audiences a constructive guideline for both individual and community healing, as well as creative resources for interfaith dialogue and peaceful coexistence among contemporary communities of believers and non-believers as well. Now, I have a rather extended biography of al-Ghazali, his spiritual biography, and I really won't go into it in the interest of time, except to say a little bit of the genesis of the work itself, which was that after having had several years of great success as a great scholar and as a great teacher, in his midlife, around the time he was about 35, 36 or so, not unlike Dante actually, he kind of experienced a deep spiritual crisis where he found himself one day walking into his lecture hall and unable to speak. And he lost his voice, and he had lost also the ability to eat or drink. And this had come about after a long period of about a year where he found himself very spiritually restless and felt as if he was more in his head than in his heart. And so he found himself unable to decide, should he stay in his work as a lecturer and a scholar, or should he find another path? And eventually what he decides to do is to leave everything behind and to go on a great spiritual quest, which takes him to all the major sites, including Damascus and Jerusalem. And of course, he does the great Hajj. And it's out of that sort of spiritual quest he goes on where he sort of finds himself rethinking what it means to be a person of faith and what do those faith tenets mean, not just for the self, but for others, that he writes and begins his great work, The Revival of Religious Sciences. And it's from that, that great work that this little treatise I will now share with you comes. So it was born out of not just a sort of intellectual decision on his part, but truly a journey of the soul and of the spirit, which stayed with him, by the way, for the rest of his life. Though he eventually does go back to teaching, his wife and his family, asked him to. But this becomes really the focus of much of his life. So just to the work. Al-Ghazali was, of course, a Muslim whose primary intention in all his works was to address and instruct other Muslims. As the title of the work, Revival of Religious Sciences, suggests, his project was to revive the spiritual life of the community of the faithful, as well as to argue for an intensified program of faith that would combine doctrine and revelation in religious study of the faith. With his work, he sought to persuade his readers to examine the sincerity and depth of their own lives as believers, both their exterior lives and in devotional practice and daily behavior, and the inner life of belief and spiritual illumination. As a scholar, he was versed in Quran, obviously Hadith, and other foundational resources of Islamic truth, and he liberally incorporated all such references into his opus. However, as a spiritual seeker and Sufi practitioner, he was also intimately aware of the spiritual and pious guidance of the mystical path, and he sought to animate the more codified approach to religion with the emotional commitment and experiential investment of the mystical path. The section on the duties of brotherhood from his great work is from the second quarter, in which section is particularly dedicated to his ideas of how to live out the faith in the world with others. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that in crafting his treatise, Al-Ghazali was thinking of the full range of Muslim brotherhood, as well as the notion of brotherhood, of course, derived in Sufism. It is vital to affirm that the following examination of the treatise accepts all that. However, it does seem that as an authentic spiritual teacher, inspired by his own journey, al-Ghazali is a teacher and spiritual guide for all ages and all faith traditions. And it is worth noting that a range of Catholic scholars and theologians read al-Ghazali in his own historical era, as I've mentioned, as well as today. And Thomas Merton, of course, is probably one of the most famous. This essay asserts that his treatise can be a worthy guide for anyone in the present era, which we know suffers from disruption, seemingly everywhere. It suffers from division and hostility and languishes with open wounds of violence and anger and the very real absence of commitment to any notion of universal brotherhood, sisterhood. Al-Ghazali offers spiritual wisdom as a guiding truth to all who are willing to practice the deep listening and the deep looking of the heart and soul. Now, from the opening paragraph on the duties of brotherhood, Al-Ghazali makes clear that any allusion to brotherhood or any assertion of bonded affinity with another is meant to be understood as a contractual obligation, a sanctioned commitment. He begins the treatise with this clarification. He writes, quote, "Know that the contract of brotherhood is a bond between two persons. The contract of brotherhood confers upon your brother a certain right touching your property, your person, your tongue, and your heart. by way of forgiveness, prayer, sincerity, loyalty, relief, and consideration. The language of contract is an important one and should be appreciated in the context of the teaching, obviously the code of Sharia, the code of Islamic jurisprudence. Combine the divine revelations of Holy Quran, the teachings of Sunnah, the spiritual and worldly wisdom of the Prophet, Sharia constitutes the main guidelines for spiritual as well as temporal Muslim conduct in this life as preparation for the hereafter. The contract law in Islamic communities is based on the understanding the daily comportment of business has relevance for life beyond just this existence. In defining brotherhood as a contractual bond, then, al-Ghazali alludes to a teaching that inveighs particularly against riba, the practice of usury, or making interest on financial possession at the expense of another. But in general, there's also the unlawful gain of one over another by putting the other at an unfair advantage. While much of the Sharia directives are merely about property and commercial transactions, I think we can see that the underlying values of the concepts can be and have been applied to a range of conventional pursuits in ordinary relationships. To exist in relation to another is conceptually akin to existing in a kind of contractual relationship, bound to engage the other with fairness, justice, generosity, and candor, as well as a willingness not to indulge too expressly for personal gain, for personal want or excessive gain. Al-Ghazali declares in his opening statement that the contract of brotherhood obliges one to vouchsafe to the other certain basic rights and entitlements that inform a relationship that is mutually binding, to be fair, just, non-exploitative, and consider the needs and circumstances of the other in all respects, both materially, then emotionally, spiritually, and intellectually. It is inspiring that al-Ghazali initiated his teaching in this work with the unmistakable claim that the spiritual path obliges each individual to place the needs and concerns of the other before his own, and to substitute personal desire with the good of the other. Al-Ghazali came to recognize that while silent prayer and solitary contemplation is indeed one dimension of devotion, for the spiritual journey to be authentic, it cannot be autonomous or impartial. It must allow for the companionship of others in order for the individual to transcend the self and to transcend the rationalization of the mind to greater movements of compassion and mercy within the heart. A central teaching of al-Ghazali's treatise is that actual spiritual growth, that is a movement towards God, cannot be limited to the singular pursuit of an individual along with his holy thoughts. Faithful progress towards the Almighty must involve not only interior assent and understanding, but also a consistent praxis, a continuous expression of virtuous behavior and moral perspicacity in daily life within a community, within a brotherhood. Admittedly, the spiritual journey becomes a meticulous balancing act between the inner life and visible comportment, each informing the other. Al-Ghazali's own life bears witness to the difficulty of sustaining that balance. Still, he declares that a kind of holiness is present when one actively encounters the other in selfless brotherhood, a dynamic commitment to the other that transcends mediations of conventional relationship. He teaches that, quote, "Your brother's need ought to be like your own, or even more important than your own. You should see that he does not have to ask, nor to reveal his need to appeal for help. You should not see yourself as having earned any right by virtue of what you have done, but rather count it as a blessing that he accepts your effort on his behalf." Al-Ghazali argues that genuine brotherhood can only be achieved when one is so aware of the presence of the other that one freely effaces personal self-interest and commits to the other even before help can be solicited. That final point is a foundational principle of al-Ghazali's instruction, because it asserts that behavior cannot be identified as virtuous if it is just a suitable reaction to a circumstantial condition or a calculated response to an immediate situation. Rather, he says, true virtue emerges from within the individual and manifests holy wisdom, a gracious perception of the world, especially in relationship with others, that has been internalized. Al-Ghazali teaches that to initiate action within a relationship is to model, constrained by human imperfection, the beneficent mercy of God, and to demonstrate a hallowed affiliation of two hearts and two souls. The teaching does exact more from the individual than is perhaps conventionally accepted, especially perhaps today in our own culture. In another section of the treatise, al-Ghazali takes to task the code of simple parity, mutual benefit, as the standard for ethical behavior, which of course is very common today, and asserts that, quote, The lowest degree in brotherhood is where you treat your brother as you would wish to be treated yourself. This is a startling declaration given our own modern fixation on the golden rule, and yet somehow very true. There's nothing particularly virtuous in treating another person in a manner that will be similarly reciprocated, because the guiding principle of such behavior is self-protection and self-interest, really not concern of the other. If, as al-Ghazali had posited, human relationships are meant to be experienced as holy encounters that can also be transformative, then the reduction of human relationships to transactional encounter is to misconstrue altogether the concept of fraternal holiness and virtue. A later Persian Sufi sheikh, Rezuban Bakli, taught that the brotherhood or companionship, quote, is the pure crucible of the goldsmith of the soul, the way station of the purification of secrets, the place where the suns of illumination rise, the wind of holy fragrance, the trace of God. It is representative of God in his creation. The experience of companionship that Bakli describes is actually the unique bond of brotherhood within the Sufi community, which he depicts as a crucible of fraternal intimacy and the locus of spiritual joy. Excuse me. His words are wondrous to contemplate in a more general sense, because a more expansive application of his understanding of human relationships, that is, to regard all human relations as holy and as a potential occasion, as potential occasions of illumination, and as representative of the bond that exists between God and creation, would surely be contributory to world healing today. When al-Ghazali taught that every person should follow the example set by the Prophet and, quote, prefer a brother to oneself and set his need before one's own, he was advocating that a condition of spiritual love expressed as profound compassion for another should be the preferred telos of human relations. Indeed, the allusion, as well as the direct reference to compassion, runs like a golden thread through much of through al-Ghazali's treatise. Compassion is at the center of his ethical teaching, despite the fact that we all know that its realization can be challenging. To live and act with authentic compassion requires tenacious resolution and constant diligence, as Ghazali notes, a relinquishment of individual desire, and a cultivation of patience and disinterest. Authentic compassion requires the transfer of identity from the self to the other, or a profound and intimate fellow feeling. Al-Ghazali makes clear that compassion abides as a disposition of empathy that must underlie all actions and so underscore the significance of the inner life of an individual. And he also then insists on its crucial influence. Ghazali wrote that it is the moral strength of an individual that shepherds the spiritual journey. If an individual saturates the inner with negative feelings such as envy and loathing for another, he, quote, has lost he, quote, has his inner full of dirt. He conceals it and does not show it, and his inner soul sweats with hidden dirt. Whenever the inner is wrapped up with rancor or envy for another, it is better to break off relation. If a man carries in his heart a bad feeling toward another Muslim, then his belief is weak, his affair is risky, and his heart is dirty, unfit to meet God. As al-Ghazali insists, if an individual harbors ill feeling and resentment toward another, even if he does not express such malice openly, he will not be able to engage another with authentic compassion, the spirit of genuine brotherhood, and so should just break off relations rather than persist in deceit. Arrogant contempt instigates deception, and a heart befouled by malevolence can never experience the meeting with God, since it is a heart closed to the hearts of others. Again, while al-Ghazali was clearly addressing directly his Muslim brotherhood, his teaching is truly universal. Can genuinely peaceful coexistence ever be achieved without compassion? The indictment of a dirty heart is startling, but it clarifies a fundamental aspect of true brotherhood, according to al-Ghazali: sincerity and honesty in all situations. Above all other relational feelings, al-Ghazali scorned hypocrisy, the dirty heart, and he emphasized that proper behaviors or pious actions cannot camouflage a selfish, unforgiving soul of any religious tradition, just as heartfelt empathy gives evidence of an unsullied heart of any religious tradition. So insistent was he on this point, then the same section of the exposition on the inner self, he cited a brief anecdote about a Jewish interlocutor who had expressed the values of sincerity and tolerance for his Muslim brother, as in a supreme example of compassionate comportment and his verification of his own teachings on acceptance. Al-Ghazali was concerned with the internal condition of human beings, not external presentation. And while he of course intended his works for his community, he did not tarry over labels or profiles. The heart was the focus of his study, and as he taught, the heart knows no religion or title or historical affiliation. Such a perspective might be obvious today, but it was somewhat exceptional in his own time. It is not surprising then that al-Ghazali deemed the virtue of forgiveness, an aspect of compassion, to be another critical component for ethical brotherhood. He insisted that forgiveness was obligatory for maintaining the bonds of brotherhood, and should one allow those fraternal bonds to be strained because of a refusal to forgive a slight, an insult, or a failing on the part of another, one, he believed, was actually indulging in evil and, in fact, abetting Satan. Al-Ghazali taught that, quote, causing separation between loved ones is one of the things dear to Satan. Separation from dear ones and brethren is to be avoided. There is no disagreement on the proper course being forgiveness and patience. You should seek 70 excuses for your brother's misdeed, and if your heart will accept none of them, you should turn the blame upon yourself. Like so many other spiritual masters, al-Ghazali asked his adherents to transcend their most human and egoistic inclinations and strive to achieve not simply self-satisfaction, but a more elevated and virtuous connection to others. To be fair, al-Ghazali recognized that he was establishing a challenging standard. He admitted in his writing that the duties of fellowship were onerous, he said, and, quote, not to be born except by one of true worth, presenting Muhammad, of course, as the perfect model. He hoped for a world in which individuals could who would be willing to seek 70 excuses for the misdeeds of others, and for those individuals to desire not division and discord, but work rather for social unity and community cohesion, even at the expense of personal pride. The social cohesion can be achieved at the price of individual will. Al-Ghazali continued to admonish his audience, his readers, that if establishing and maintaining genuine relations were to fail, each individual must look first to his own heart, his own intentions, and accept responsibility for then creating the space of care and forgiveness. The judgment an individual is all too eager to cast upon another must be, al-Ghazali instructs, cast upon himself. Forgiveness is an active process of generous sympathy, but also of exigent accountability, if not actual self-transformation. Forgiveness requires determination and a ready patience to disregard personal suffering in order to sustain the covenant or contract, the perpetual bond that connects all people together as sons and daughters of God. Moreover, apart from any emotional hesitation to ignore insult or injury, an individual can find it challenging to act upon the call of forgiveness when the surrounding general culture, perhaps our own, might not privilege the virtues of mercy and humility. Authentic forgiveness requires a degree of forbearance and courage to be unconventionally self-aware. The call to forgiveness is always a call to the heart, to the inner state of the human being. The great spiritual teachers understand that a thriving community, a heartfelt brotherhood, will never be firmly and fully realized until there is a correspondence between the inner and the outer being in each person, so that each individual can engage with the other in honesty and compassion. So also the full realization of an individual will never be realized until there is not simply correlation between the inner and the outer condition, but the inner directs and guides the simple acts of the outer person. Al-Ghazali concluded his treatise with a reminder of this guiding principle, that the, quote, manners of our outer are only the title page of the inner and of the purity of heart. When hearts are purified, there is no need for formality or codified behaviors to display their content. From the experience of his own spiritual journey and his deep contemplation of holy truth emerging from sacred texts, al-Ghazali understood that the true nature of every human being lies in the inner, in the heart. And it is the heart, not the hand or the foot or any part of the body, even the mind, that is the true guide in the journey to God in this world and the life to come. So very quickly at the very end, a final thought. At a time when the world seems on the brink of fracturing into multiple defensive divisions, and many groups are seemingly unable or quite honestly unwilling to address the brokenness with any degree of tolerance or depth, it seems a reasonable proposition to reach back into history for possible guidance, even solutions, in order to create a global space of peace and authentic coexistence. The guidance can take many forms, not the least of which is spiritual guidance, even though contemporary discourse often accuses religions, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, as the culprit in social, political, and personal disaffection. Within every religion, there have been in our spiritual teachers who can be rich resources for reflection and inspiration. They are the ones who've been able to transcend the synthetic borders that history and politics and language have erected, and these borders that have too often separated and continue to divide people and communities. Such spiritual leaders, while adhering to their chosen faith traditions, share wisdom that need not be confined to a single group of believers or an autonomy community of adherents. Rather, those spiritual teachers, like al-Ghazali, are the everlasting educators of the spirit. They offer endearing truths that exist without borders or restrictions and speak across the barriers of time and cultural mores. Pious sages like al-Ghazali contemplate sacred teachings in the depth of their miraculous revelation, and then free those texts to become universal and to resonate one generation to another, one faith community to another, one individual to another. The spiritual teachers are empathic believers who understand that God speaks to everyone. Al-Ghazali was one such spiritual teacher. His life story, which he shared, can be regarded as a kind of chronicle of journey to gain wisdom and peace. His words echo over centuries to speak to all generations and all religious persuasions because of his devotion, his honesty, his benevolence, and optimism.
We need to wrap up, Dr. Greeley.
Yes, very last sentence. Devout in his own faith and committed to his Islamic Brotherhood, he applied his wisdom and his teachings for the benefit of human society. He urged us to regard human relationships not so much as burdens, but as benedictions, to engage the other always as relational and not transactional, and to recognize the place of sincere self-awareness as a necessary precondition of entering into any relationship with God and with others, and to perceive at all times, with the heart, the reality of the divine amid even the most mundane of circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for a very rich paper. I look forward to the discussion after our presentations because there is so much in that, obviously, that is relevant across traditions and particularly for our own time. So thank you for that. Our next presenter is Dr. Haava Arslan from Üsküdar University in Istanbul. I hope I gave some resemblance of pronunciation there.
Perfect pronunciation.
Teşekkürler. She will be speaking on developing a sacred, mystical-based ontological and epistemological framework for peace studies. Dr. Arslan, please.
Thank you. Can you give me permission to share my screen, please?
Yes, I will get right on that.
Thank you.
You should be able to do so now.
All right, great. Thank you. Yeah, okay. Sorry. Yes. So I am very pleased to be among you. It's first time I am in such a distinguished, audience, because I mean this, because I'm coming from a totally different background. I have my political science background. I did my PhD in international relations, and I have a secular, I have had a secular life until 2 years ago. So I will, and I'm intending to turn this presentation into another PhD, second PhD in Üsküdar University, because we have a institute of Sufi studies in our university. So I'm trying to combine this Sufi mystic perspective into peace studies or political science. So I'm having different ideas. Therefore, your feedback would be very useful and very helpful for me. Okay, so where did I come from? How did my how did I come to this point? Therefore, I would like to give some background about my sorry. So this study, this presentation grew slowly, and it went through a number of stages. Firstly, I have engaged with international relations studies from a mostly realist perspective, which is survival level perspective, for about 15 years. But there was something, missing. At that time I was describing the situation I was in, my soul was aching. I was saying to my friends and to my family that I wasn't happy, and my soul was aching. I had not really described what I was going through at that time, but now, after especially making a lot of reading for this presentation today, that I was searching for ways to rely my spirit with the divine. So I'm so happy that you gave this opportunity to me. But this frustration that I was, having was very common among my friends and my, not only academically but also in my family and personal friends. And most of us was, we were tired of, spiritually we were tired. We had apathy, state of apathy in whatever we were doing academically, professionally or in our personal life. And we were not able to ask, great questions, grand questions about life. So we all shared the similar pessimism, anguish, skepticism, despair towards, 20th century problems, world problems. Because if you're, studying and teaching international relations, political science, we talk about the wars in the 20th century. In both West in the East and the West, millions of people have been killed. Several tens of major universities have been burned at the end of educated humanity. The gas chamber of the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing, environmental catastrophe on the planetary scale. These are the subjects that we are supposed to teach in international relations. But yet, what is really very frustrating was that all of these projects were they were the results of the highly educated professors who had not moral tuition, and creation of highly educated academics who had not received moral tuition. So this was another, frustration that we were sharing together. And slowly, I was having this idea, this, deep thought that humanity educated in this way, and academics, people educated in this way, we will always be defeated by the upsurge of the raw nature, because we were operating from our raw nature and survival instincts. However, now that it has been armed with irresponsible education, the ungovernability of raw human nature is far more dangerous than it was the case in the educated savage. We blame or we criticize uneducated savage or caveman, but we were worse than of that people. So therefore, in about 10 years ago, I have decided to stop my IR perspective, and I was looking for to go for a new field, which was, I discovered that peace studies. Therefore, I went to Austria and I looked for, I educated myself, and I brought this. I opened the first MA in Peace and Conflict Studies in Turkey, in Ankara. I was in Ankara at that time. So I seemed happy. I was happy for a while. But then, the coup d'etat in 2016, during that coup d'etat, the program was shut down. So there was some, chaos in Turkey. This threw me into another chaos or another personal crisis, spiritual crisis that I could not really name at that time, and which was something good. Now I can understand, because I was not looking for my spiritual. I had not found my spiritual way. Another stage, it was third stage, and I was again looking for a way out. In 2018, I came to realize that, asking questions, since peace studies did not give the answers to my problems personally, and also to political problems that all over the world is going through. And then I started to ask questions about what about God? What is he has to say? He has to do something about it. Why is he not saying about what's going on? Then the question came to my mind: might all the tragedy in global affairs come from godlessness? And how can we understand God and the world the world and human spirit and the cosmos, unity of cosmos? So the questions that I could not really give the answer at that time. So when we go back to definition of peace and conflict studies, I'd like to mention a little bit about my disappointment of peace and conflict studies. Definition is actually, let me be very very short, that peace studies wants to bring peace to the world, resolve all the conflicts and violence with non-violent means. So peace studies are very passionate to make the world more more just and sustainable society and the whole globe, and explore approaches to transform an unjust world into a violent world into a just and peaceful world. So these are the passionate aims of peace studies. So this curriculum that I actually adapted to in my peace and conflict studies in Ankara, the curriculum looked like this. However, when I came to realize, after 2016 coup attempt, and with the questions of what has got to do with all of this, the answer came to my I was having some answers that peace studies tend to focus on such issues such as injustice, violence, conflict, and war from a duality-oriented framework. So there was a problem of worldview, dual worldview. For example, we were not asking questions about the nature of peace. We were not asking why are we here in this life? What is the nature of peace? Ontological questions we weren't asking really, and how do we really give answers to this question of nature of peace? The sources of means of these questions. So there was so I came to this kind of answer. Now I'm pretty certain that the peace studies also, not only peace studies, but all the other social studies need a sacred worldview, because when without life, without God, without divine, can easily turn into a catastrophe. So Prince Charles, in his speech, he gives this, why is this so? Why we are having so much violence in this world? He says that we have lost our way because we can no longer see clearly, and we have forgotten. A world of parts has replaced a world of wholeness. A world of separation has replaced a world of connectedness and entanglement. The secular has pushed aside the sacred. And as Rumi, and let me also mention that I'm from the city of Konya, from Rumi, so I'm from a very holy city. Although I had secular background, my genetics must have affected me. He said that reason serves humanity that is educated, but without moral tuition, in just the same as that a candle serves a thief while he's stealing. Okay, so we had we are still having serious consequences of loss of our awareness of the sacred, and we are learning irresponsible, we are getting irresponsible knowledge, and we are I'm personally teaching my students irresponsible knowledge, and I don't want to do it anymore. Therefore, I want to really develop a sacred-based curriculum for peace studies. Because in Hadith, our prophet says that he says, "Oh God, I seek refuge from a knowledge that has no benefit." So therefore, I keep saying every day that I don't want any knowledge that has no benefit, for me and for the whole humanity. And also, I like this Gospel of John: "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." So I want to be free from useless knowledge. So is there a way out? Peace studies programs, we can, if we transform the worldview of peace studies program from a more modern worldview to a more sacred worldview, this might be a way out. This is my one of the answers that I come to my mind. But such a transformation requires an integrated view of peace as a psychological, political, moral, spiritual, and depends merely on reducing conflict, but on the actively creating unity. Okay, because modern contemporary peace studies, they are trying to reduce conflict, but you're not really aiming to create unity. So from a modern scientific mechanistic worldview, to a more sacred, divine-based worldview we need to really move. And I really love this Yunus Emre, 13th century Turkish mystic, saying that knowledge, when he described knowledge, what kind of knowledge, in his poem he says, knowledge should mean a full grasp of knowledge. Knowledge means to know yourself, heart and soul. If you fail to understand yourself, then all of your reading has missed its call. What is the purpose of reading those books? So that man can know the all-powerful. If you have read but failed to understand, then your efforts are just a barren toil. Don't boast of reading, mastering science, or of your all prayers and obedience. If you don't identify man as God, all your learning is no use at all. So worldview, what is worldview and how to change it? And yeah, the definition of worldview is that, might be very obvious to all of you, that worldviews are overarching systems of meaning within which individuals and groups interpret the nature of reality, the purpose of life, and the laws governing life. This is according to the Wheat. So our worldviews do not just affect our perception of the world around us. Our worldviews also determine the nature of our relationships, the type of societies we create, the ways we approach science and religion, and the manner in which we deal with opportunities and challenges that we encounter in our lives. So our worldviews affect every aspect of our lives and everything we do. So, today, in contemporary world life, there are two major worldviews: the traditional worldview and the modern worldview. And all the other ways are variants of one of these two. For example, we can also talk about postmodern worldview. This is a variation of modern worldview. The traditional worldview holds that the world is ordered, intelligent, intelligible, and good, and that there are objective moral truths which we can know, and that human beings can achieve true happiness only by following our inborn nature, which draws us toward our own perfection. It is based on a God-centered, divine-centered understanding of the world. Okay, and this was a classical worldview, which was very known in all the classical civilizations, from Native Americans to Australian Aborigines, Chinese Empire, Indian Empire, Persian, Turkish, Egyptian, all over the ancient civilizations. The modern worldview, however, tend to emphasize rationality, science, logic, and critical thinking. They often question imposed views from religious traditions and the past. Science is often seen as the ultimate and sometimes even exclusive source of reliable knowledge. It is the only way to find out what is real and true. The vision of reality tends to be materialistic. There is nothing beyond what we can observe with the senses and their extensions. Life is a product of random, unconscious evolutionary processes, and the existence of a higher power, divine reality, or intangible dimension is frequently rejected. This creates a separation between humans as conscious subjects in a world of unconscious objects. So what is a man, human being, according to two different worldviews? According to modern science, man will either remain modern science will either remain silent through awareness of its limits, or it will reply by saying that man is an animal with particularly well-developed cerebral faculties. And if one should raise the question as to the origin of this animal, it will speak to you about an infinitely long chain of coincidences, accidents, and chances, as much as to say that existence of man has no meaning. According to science sacred knowledge, according to Islamic tradition as well as in Abrahamic traditions, man is the creation of God. God created man in his own image, so it's very holy. This means that man, who is God's vicegerent and created in the likeness of God, is like God, and of course God's vicegerent should logically be in some respect similar to God. So it is very noble, very sacred role that we have according to traditional worldview. However, this is what we are having today about the image of cosmos is totally the opposite. And Nietzsche, if we read Nietzsche, you know, as he gives such a pessimist explanation or expression, definition of the cosmos, that you can, you know, heartlessness, unreason to their opposite. So it is very, you know, very depressive, let me say. And this quotation, this thought, is shared by almost everyone alive today. So for the way we see the universe is not separate from the way we see ourselves. So we see the universe as a, you know, chaotic, bad, and you know, materialistic way. This is the same we see our own personal and the personal, ourselves personally and our life. If our cosmos is chaotic and meaningless, how can we be harmonious and our lives have true purpose? If our cosmos is cold and empty, how can we be otherwise? So this integration from the divine, from the sacred, had some very serious consequences. And our universe integrates from a unified, meaningful whole into a congruous of unrelated objects separated by unfathomable distances of the cold black space. So our social fabric is unwoven. So the world is meaningless and empty. So I don't want to go further on this meaningless. And so in short, William Chittick is a you know, very let me say a man of God.
You should begin to wrap up, Dr. Arslan.
Okay, so how many minutes do I have?
You have 3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. So we need to really change our worldview. So in order to change our worldview, we need to have different metaphysical and ontological and epistemological understanding. Okay, I go very fast. Right. So the traditional ontology and epistemology I explained here. Basically, what I'm saying is we need to move from the you know, modernist, mechanical, materialistic worldview, metaphysics, and ontological and epistemological understanding to more traditional, sacred, and divine based worldview. Okay. So as a conclusion, peace studies should begin with the premise that our main objective in life should be our relation with God and the return to our Creator with purified souls and prepared for eternity. So this follows naturally that peace studies academics therefore should initially learn to understand the divine principle and its reflection in manifestation and all that this understanding implies for their own lives, that is how to cultivate a relationship with God. So explore the meaning of the sacred, explore how it can be known through the revealed theophany of scripture, nature's interiority, and sacred art. So my intention in this, you know, new PhD, what I'm intending to do is explore dimensions of manifestations of the sacred in terms of the peace studies curriculum. So I would like to really rewrite each for each course the new definition of each course is based on science sacra, let me say. Okay, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arslan. And we can return now to our original screen. Thank you very much. There is much to discuss there. Okay, our final speaker for this morning's session is Dr. Martin Awaana Wullobayi from Peace Sci in Rome, and he will be speaking to us on the mystical marriage in the thought of Mahmud, Muhammad, Taha. So please, Dr. Wullobayi. Martin, are you there?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I thank the first two panelists for their presentations and also the organizers of this conference for allowing me to present my paper on mystical marriage in the thought of Mahmud Mohammed Taha. I've lived in the Sudan, and also I came across the disciples of Taha. He was a 20th century Sudanese reformist who died in 1985. In this presentation, I will be examining his views on marriage in the Sufi themes of Sharia, that is Islamic law, and Hakika, esoteric or inner truth, as a case study. In the early 1950s, Taha became the founder of a spiritual religious organization, Al-Ikhwan al-Jumhuriyun, the Republican Brothers. As a Sufi, Taha realized that women's advancement depended on redefining marriage laws built on the strength of the original Quranic text, founded on the principles of the revealed message in Mecca, which guaranteed gender equality. Taha used the Sufi themes as a means to enhance equality, dignity, individuals' freedom, and spiritual development so as to create a peaceful marriage relationship between husband and wife. Taha is best known for the book, The Second Message of Islam, the clearest proposal of the author's ideology. The ideology of Taha is based on following the Sunnah of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, which leads to the knowledge of God, the Creator. The core of his teaching, based on Quranic verses, stresses that the original teaching of Islam involves complete equality between men and women, as expressed by the equal responsibility they have before God on the day of judgment. For him, Islam's original teaching is that marriage is between one man and one wife without dowry, that is mahr, or divorce. So in an attempt to reinterpret marriage laws from within the text of the Quran, Taha posits that Islam has two messages, both contained in the Quran, revealed to Muhammad in two different phases. He calls the first Quranic revelation in Mecca as the second message of Islam. However, the second phase of the revelation and its laws in Medina, he calls that one the first message of Islam. And according to him, the people of 7th century Arabian society accepted this message of Islam and its laws in Medina because they were in conformity with the historical context. Taha and his disciples claim that much of the classical Islamic jurisprudence, that is fiqh, relied on the Quranic text of Medina, which Muslims generally refer to as Sharia or Islamic law. However, they argued that the laws here elaborated in the Sharia do not resolve the issues of equality in the institution of marriage. Taha then calls not only for a renewed application of those texts of the Quran which were postponed or suspended in the case of the Meccan verses, but for their universal legislative force, since they respond to the current needs of society. Taha's ideology reflects his spiritual transformation after he emerged from his self-imposed religious seclusion, that is Khalwa, which orientated his new mission with an integrated ideology of the evolution of Islamic law towards the future Islamic legal reform. In the light of this, he reconsidered the marriage laws of Sharia and further explained marriage using the two core Sufi words, Sharia and Hakika. And one sees this especially in his book published in 1971, Tatwir al-Sharia al-Ahwal al-Shakhsiyya, the evolution of the personal status law. Essentially, Sharia and Hakika are inseparable realities in the different stages in Sufi practice and understanding. Sharia continues to be for Muslims a divine law providing believers moral guidance. Hakika here expresses the inner truth. It is an aspect of esoteric truth that is deduced from observation, which one cannot directly perceive. This esoteric or inner truth includes not only the Hakika, but also the Sufi path, Tariqa, that enables a believer to move from the Sharia to the Hakika. So like any Sufi, Taha also upholds the divine nature of Sharia and believes in the oneness of God, Tawheed. However, unlike Islamic scholars who put together the Quran and Sunnah as sources of Sharia, Taha made a clear distinction between Sunnah and Sharia. And according to him, the Sunnah is limited to the personal practice and statements of Muhammad, while Sharia is what he will ask his companions to do. For the disciples of Taha, the second message simply means reviving the Sunnah and making it the law for today's society. And this is based on a hadith, which says, "The strangers are," and I quote, "those who will revive my Sunnah after it had been abandoned," unquote. So at the core of the marriage practice in Sharia, Taha and his disciples developed a simple marriage celebration and implemented the principle of equality based on a booklet published by Taha in 1971, Khatwa Nahwa Azawaj fi Islam, a step towards marriage in Islam. So when Taha proposed the methodology described in his booklet, he raised controversy among the Sudanese public. The public failed to understand that the main objective of Taha's methodology was to reinterpret marriage laws designed by legal customs so as to restore dignity to women within the limits permitted by the traditional Sharia. Meanwhile, to resolve the legal issue associated with marriage, Taha considers two intersecting levels of Sharia in Islam: the traditional Sharia based on the Medina text and the new Sharia derived from the Meccan revelation. The idea behind this is the reinterpretation of marriage laws within already existing traditional Sharia. This Sharia generally held that 4 conditions must be satisfied before marriage can take place between a man and a woman. 1, the legal impediment, that is mahal. 2, the 2 witnesses, shahidan. And 3, the dawa, mahar, that is the bridal gift to the wife. And the 4th one is the agreement of the woman's guardian, wali. So in the second message of Islam, according to Taha, where men and women are equal partners, only 2 of the 4 conditions remain: the legal impediments and the 2 witnesses. Some intersections exist between these sets of laws. For example, some hold that mahar can be nominal or symbolic, and that the guardian could be the woman herself. So according to the Hanafi school of fiqh, based on the Sharia of the first message, a woman can marry herself to a man if he is of equal status to her, that is kafar, negating the need for a male guardian, that is the wali. So according to Taha, if a woman acts within the stipulated conditions, no reproach comes against her for acting as a guardian to herself. However, the jurists define this kafar clause in 6 areas: Islam, freedom, profession, wealth, lineage, and piety. This means that a free woman should choose a man who is also free and is of the same wealth and professional class as her family. Otherwise, her family may object to that marriage based on this kafar clause. So since Taha's methodology concerns Islamic laws, it tried to highlight the brightest spots in these laws and use them until the complete transformation to the second message of Islam is achieved. Hence, the disciples of Taha used the nominal dawah of 1 Sudanese pound and interjected the practice of delegation, tafweed. So the amount here complied with legal norms, but they hope to abolish dawah with its customary material value. And according to Abdullahi Ahmad An-Na'im, and I quote, The purpose would, of course, be better achieved if mahar were abolished altogether, but that is not possible under the present circumstances. And Taha comments that reduction of the material dawah without translating this into dignity is nothing more than a disregard for women. So as for the kafah, Taha argues that the areas such as Islam, freedom, profession, and wealth, areas which concern the Hanafi jurists, were outdated and violated the spirit of Islam itself. So Taha explained that Islam here means what? The utterance or saying of the Shahada and pretending to be a Muslim. But he does not consider these a true measure for the quality of a man. Also, freedom is an outdated racial attribute which has no place in our today's society. For Taha says, the original precept of Islam was freedom. And also, he says, profession and wealth also do not measure the quality of a person's character. However, lineage, nasab, as a qualification for marriage goes contrary to what? To Taha's advocacy for social equality. Lineage is connected to demonstrating good ethics and values. So if a man comes from low lineage, but demonstrates that he has high ethics and values, the guardian does not have the authority to object to the marriage. So Taha supports this argument with a hadith which says, when someone whose religion and character you are pleased with comes to you, then marry your daughter to him. If you do not do so, then there will be turmoil in the land and widespread corruption, unquote. Now, with regard to piety, Taha explained that a pious man can be of any religion or creed as long as he has a good moral character. And I think that this is the refined Sharia for marriage, and so it can take a good step towards marriage in the second message of Islam. Taha says, the criterion of social equality is that marriage, the most fundamental and intimate relation, is possible between any man and any woman. This is the accurate test of social equality. So Taha approaches gender equality within the legal framework of Islam. Now, at the heart of Taha's view on marriage, we see a shift from marriage in Sharia to marriage in Hakika. His use of Sufi themes for marriage was necessary, since esoteric truth evokes a spiritual level and has a great significance in Sufi traditions. His ideas about Sharia and the relationship between married couples expressed within the framework of Hakika was born out of an intense moment of his personal spiritual reflection. Taha claims that marriage in Islam is a sacred bond, ribat muqaddas, and an eternal relationship between a man and a woman. However, legal marriage within Sharia is an attempt whereby a man and a woman strive to achieve the relationship that existed between Adam and Eve when Eve was taken out of Adam. So for Taha, God revealed the Quran with its dual meanings, and as such, the concept of Sharia and Hakika reflects his interpretation of the Quran. He applied this concept of Sharia Hakika duality to marriage. So the practice of marriage in Hakika has the highest place of honor among human relations, making it an essential means for the rediscovery of the lost self. So in reference to marriage in Hakika, Taha says, and he uses Quran 41 verses 53, and I quote, "We will show them our signs in their horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth." This surah adds an in-depth sense of the abundant Sufi symbolism in understanding marriage in Hakika. The signs in the horizon and within themselves, nufus, illustrate an opposition between outer signs and inner signs. And Taha interprets the text to mean that a man's wife is his corresponding part, the manifestation of his own self outside himself. And he reaffirms that she is the totality of the outward sign corresponding to the man's, corresponding to self outside, no, corresponding to the man's self. So in other words, the husband and wife unite in the one self. And before Taha, we find a similar interpretation in Ibn Arabi's works, saying, we will show them our signs in the horizons, is that which is outside of you. And also, we will show them within themselves refers to the sign inside the person. So we can say that the signs of the apparent and hidden, to some extent, are within the heart of the individual. Taha's redefinition of marriage, seeing a man's wife as the totality of the outward sign in relation to his inner self, reflects his vision of their mutual desire to unite in the state of completeness in marriage without any contemplation of divorce. To conclude, Taha contributed to Islam by reinterpreting Sharia in order to attain an Islamic law for gender equality based on his second message of Islam. However, some scholars would simply see his ideology as a disservice to the general opinion of Muslims, especially when he proposed the suspension of some parts of the Quran as revealed in Medina in favor of text of the Quran revealed in Mecca. Taha saw in Islam a vision of legal equality for women in the institution of marriage. As such, he attempted to remove the traditional Sharia disadvantages imposed on women in order to reconstruct a marriage institution based on the original message of the Quran. Taha's approach to Islam is in a changing society using Sufi lens was important for his followers. One recognizes in them a marriage practice which could be a model for contemporary marriage in Sudan and elsewhere, as there is a sense of legal transformation and spiritual meaning. Their marriage practice tends to play a greater role in the advancement of every individual's happiness and spiritual development. As Edward Thomas observes, Taha's vivid spiritual experience not only helped him to reach some conclusions about the need to change Sharia, but also to express his sense of self-realization in using Sufi language and symbols. Taha's own inner self-transformation, I would say, as a Sufi, helped him reach the perfection that provides the possibility for change in how one becomes the other in relation to the self. His experience also contributed to an inner transformation of marriage and its positive effect on society, which traditional Sharia debate is unable to address. In any case, the second message of Islam sets a new benchmark for social equality, as marriage is possible between any man and any woman, where their creed and religious affiliation is not a problem, provided that each one has a good moral character. So in reality, Taha's ideology could thus be considered an improved Sharia for a positive step towards marriage in the second message of Islam for a peaceful coexistence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wullobayi. Okay, now is the time where we can interact with our speakers. Please submit your questions directly to them. I think it will save time. So if you have not yet submitted your questions to each of the speakers, please do so now.
I'm trying to read the, I have comments, but let's go. Yeah, I have comments, not really a question.
Okay, we can come back to those. Let's go on to Dr. Greeley. I know that my brother Jason Welly was very interested in your paper, and so I think you must have a question from him.
I do. Would you like me to read it? I'm not sure how you want to, what the protocol is. Should I read it?
I think you can kind of summarize the question if you'd like.
Okay, or does he want to summarize his own question and I could answer it, or?
That's fine. Jason,
Yeah, let's have a conversation.
You can ask your question.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I'll try and be brief. Thank you.
Thank you.
So my first question has to do with the difference between ukhuwa and sohba, between brotherhood and companionship, because in the title of the treatise that she is looking at, both of those words appear, and I wonder if the distinction between them is important, because for some Sufis, this distinction is important. And so I was curious about her reading of this part of Ghazali. And then my second question has to do with the question of rights. Haq al-Muslim al-Muslim, the rights that a Muslim can claim or expect from a fellow Muslim, because the section of the treatise, the section of Ghazali's work immediately following this treatise deals with precisely this question. So if we're inclined to see Ghazali as offering resources for a more universalist ethic, how do we think about whether co-religionists can make specific claims on each other, on members of their own tradition, as opposed to speaking generally about kinship or fraternity? So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Sure,
thank you for a great paper.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll start with the second one because it's the one most in our minds, and I guess maybe that would lend itself to our own conversation. But this idea of using a text that is clearly designated for one religious tradition, one group, and sort of universalizing it, I guess is sort of a fraught conversation. And what I like to do is, as I said in the paper, in sort of an academic setting, obviously we would align it with exactly the time and the place and the group to which he is most, where he's addressing and, and dealing with all of that. But what I really believe about our mystics particularly, but our great spiritual teachers, is that I don't know if we have the right, but I'd like to think that we're given the opportunity to lift from their teachings what clearly are the kinds of universal ideas that I think work with, for all religious traditions, and we might have some disagreements. So when we take some of these ideas, as you said, where we have the integrity of each religious tradition and we have our own truths, and then how do we find conversations? I mean, that's kind of our modern problem. And this is something that I know Dr. Arslan was addressing. So what I tend to do in this kind of setting is offer, the spiritual teaching of someone like Ghazali, to say we have historically what he would literally mean by brotherhood, what he literally mean by companionship. But if we can glean from, and I think I wrote this to you, but if we can glean from his text some of these ideas that allow us to, while he might have intended it one way without doing injustice to his intention, allowing us to have a conversation with him and sharing it in either our own faith lives or our own spiritual traditions, and bringing it into sort of the wider conversation. I think, that I guess has been an issue of a kind of way of reading that I know is something somewhat vexed, but I do think that as a Sufi in particular, I have a sense, I would like to think, I shouldn't say I have a sense, I would like to think that we could bring his ideas into a wider conversation. So that was just kind of a general way of thinking about it, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that issue of the, what we do with texts that aren't of our own traditions, and do we have a right to bring it into the wider conversation? Because that's kind of what I do a lot of.
Sandra, would you like to ask a question?
Well, all right, so I had a question for Dr. Greeley, and then also just sort of a follow-up to the question that was just asked. So the first question, Dr. Greeley, refers back to the beginning of your presentation.
Yes.
Where it's not uncommon for mystically oriented religious individuals to be so in their head that they become lost and isolated from community, and so much else that you spoke about in terms of losing a sense of balance. In the Jewish community and Jewish mysticism, we have several individuals, teachers, incredible people, who died quite young, one who literally starved himself to death as a result of this isolation, understanding Jewish law, but getting so lost in mysticism and not understanding how they were supposed to come together that he sort of literally like floated away. While al-Ghazali ultimately found balance in his life, because you spoke about this precarious kind of pressure point in his own life, did he speak specifically to this potential imbalance and the dire results? And the second question, which is a follow-up to what was just said, was I am dealing with this all the time. And I think it's really important for all of us to, and my frustration with this conference is that we come, we hear these amazing things, and then we all go our way. I would love to have some crowdsourcing. I shared this with Dr. Arslan, and we've already kind of arranged and we're going to get together. But I think the issue of how we come together with our own truths and be clear about them so that I can hear you. Understanding and making parallels is not the same as conflation. And I think a lot of times that's what happens. And when we do that, we don't truly see the other, and we don't do honor to our own background and our own sources either.
Yes. Yes. I don't know. So to the first part, I guess, about the mystics, so my background is primarily in the sort of in medieval mystics as well as contemporary. And yes, there is that tendency, just as you can have someone who is so dogmatic, and this is what al-Ghazali's issue was, and so much in his or her head that for that person, the faith becomes just sort of a series of rules and doctrines and teachings and dogma that is just sort of performative and exclusionary and doesn't really mean anything outside of that. And to the other side, exactly as you said, Doctor, this idea that you can have somebody who's so spiritually, I mean, my beloved Catherine of Siena was probably not unlike your, I mean, you can have somebody who's so caught up in a kind of spiritual realm that they lose touch. But I do think people like al-Ghazali and there are other mystics, I won't name them, but certainly in the Christian tradition and others who can find that balance. And I think to your point, yes, he was at a point in his life in his 30s. I mean, maybe we know the story, a lot of people know the story, where he lost the power of speech, he couldn't eat, he couldn't drink. He absolutely believed it had to do with his own spiritual turmoil. And he went on a great quest, and he did the Hajj, and he sort of did a lot of this spiritual deep meditation and contemplation. But he eventually found himself back after several years teaching and with his family, and yet sustaining this kind of Sufi approach. So I think that idea of balance is important. I do believe strongly, though, as I get older, and particularly in my own faith life, my own faith tradition, I should say as well, that we need the mystics and we need the spiritual teachers more than we need the dogmatists. I'm a Catholic, so and I'm a medievalist. So I come from a tradition where there's a lot of dogma and doctrine, much of which, is very important to me. But I find the richness of my faith, and I'll just be personal for a moment, really comes from the spiritual teachers in my tradition. And I was actually thinking of this a little bit. I don't mean to deflect. I just wanted to say something to Dr. Arslan, but this idea of the traditional and the modern, it strikes me that our quest of, one of my favorite authors is a medieval philosopher, theologian named Anselm. And Anselm of Canterbury once said that, faith seeking understanding and this balance of faith and reason and trying to bring the two together. And so I think it's our spiritual teachers. I think they're the ones who teach us both the beauties of our own tradition, but then to let go of our ownness of our own tradition and see the beauties in others. And I absolutely take your point, Doctor, this idea of, kind of nominating, but not really bringing together. And how do we do that? And that's our vexed situation, respecting the other tradition, and yet finding a way to sort of see it not just as, gee, you're like me, or we're very similar, or you are similar to me, but there's your truth that I honor in and of itself. And for those of us who are faithful to our tradition, I absolutely agree with you. That's our task. And I don't have any easy answers. I actually just did a paper, speaking of Jewish mysticism, I actually just did a paper for Medieval Conference on a Jewish mystic poet named Yehuda Halevi, who wrote about these journeys to Jerusalem, very timely with everything going on. And then, trying to find, and the language that he uses is so similar to some others of Christian writers, and yet the Christian writers are saying the same thing for a lot of other different reasons, if you know what I mean. So yes, I agree with you. I don't know what I guess what a conference like this is trying to do is how do we love each other in each other's own specificity and yet find that common ground. I don't know, other people might have better ideas than me. I just know it's an ongoing quest.
Thank you. I saw my brother Mustafa's hand up. Mustafa, how are you?
He's muted, I think.
Oh, could you unmute Mustafa?
Yes, thank you, and thank you everyone. It's great to see you all. And yeah, I just wanted to make a comment on the first and the second presentations, Dr. Greeley and Dr. Arslan. I think, I don't know, I guess overall our papers in this conference fit together in terms of peace and conflict resolution, but I just saw this great connection. Actually, they almost complete each other in terms of the message. One is of course more spiritual with Dr. Greeley's, more personal in terms of relationships, but with Dr. Arslan, I could see my own background in international relations in that, and I think that was a great point that you made. I just had a talk a couple of weeks ago addressing the Persian security issues, and one of the people in the audience asked, so how do we justify the U.S. presence in the Persian Gulf with so many, dozens of military bases? And from a realist perspective, that is the right thing to do. Or if the U.S. has the power, then she can do it. But then why don't we ask the question, is that right? How do we judge what is right and what is wrong? What is the moral guidance? And without that, then might makes right? However, I think our teachers teach us that right should make might, right? So we should really focus on what is right. And so without that compass, where our peace studies go, where our international relations go, and then where do our relationships go, right? With our friends and the community. So it was really quite eye-opening for me. And thank you for those presentations. I was just imagining this wonderful collaboration between those two papers. And I just wanted to also point out that in the next panel, I think session number 2, session 6, panel 2, where I will be the moderator, a couple of the papers actually quite overlap with the same idea. So maybe other papers too, but I just wanted to point that out for those who are interested. So thank you. And if you have any comments on that, I would love to hear those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. Other questions or comments?
Could I just make a comment on what he just said? Because I think it's so important. Thank you so much for your words. I think that's the real challenge, right? Is the love for the stranger, the love for the other. I mean, I think that so much of what we work with is this idea of loving and caring for those around us, those whom we know, those who are like us, those who are similar to us. I do believe our great spiritual teachers of all traditions do ask us to step out of our own world, though, and to your point, if we can extend the love, and this is what I think when Ghazali says, it's sort of, cheap grace, sorry for that expression, but it's cheap to say it, that it's easy to say, when al-Ghazali says, when it's easy to say, I want you to do to me as I will do to you, we make it very personal and transactional. And he says, no, you've got to rise above that. And you have to simply do for the other regardless. And that other then becomes the stranger. I mean, that's our world, right? I think you're so right. That's, how do we do that? How do we truly love, sorry, it's a Christian sense, but that idea of love in that pure sense, the people who are not like us, the people who look differently, sound differently, think differently, not even just religiously, talk differently, maybe even hate us, and that call to loving those who hate us, I mean, that's really, I think the more we can work towards that, and I don't know how we do it. Maybe our teachers are right. Maybe it's one person at a time. And we sort of do it one step at a time. But I think your comments, it just struck me as so important, this idea of what we're doing politically, and is it because the people are different from us, and do we make the judgments based on that? So thank you for that. I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Are there other questions and comments? Martin, please.
Yeah, there's a question from Dr. Sandra. Now, what motivated Taha's work regarding women and how it is supposed to work? You know, Taha, for what I'll say is that he was interested in the fundamental equality, and for him what is important is the family. If there's no equality in the family, then the public arena will not be, that equality will not reflect there. So what is important is the private life. And if there is equality within the family, if women are respected, are seen as equal, the dignity, if their dignity is restored to them, then the society too will also recognize them, because, and he gave an example, for example, that if you have a woman who is a high court judge, and in the 70s in Sudan, already they had high court judges who were women, and to have a woman who is a high court judge, and then he's seen as secondary in the society, and the watchman who is at the gate of the court is considered important than her, then how can we justify this? And the only thing we can do is we find a solution in the Quran, and for example, when he speaks about eschatology, equality on the day of judgment, we are all equal, and that's the foundation of his approach as well. So from there, if one is able to build, to see the humanity having a common destiny, so at that point, we will begin to respect women and respect men as equal, giving them their dignity, so that we'll move together and then build as humanity, one humanity. And then also, in order to practice what he preached, that is why the disciples implemented the methodology which he proposed. For example, when it comes to the marriage, the dowry, instead of paying extravagant money in order to get the woman, why not reduce that amount to 1 Sudanese pound? That is, which is practically nothing. It's just like it means nothing, because the woman's dignity is more than giving that money. And also, it has its sources in the Sharia, because the Hanafi school is part of that's part of the Sharia, and then and as such, that is not outside the boundary of the legal when it comes to the legal issue of Islam. And for that matter, their marriage practice, instead of paying extravagant money and also buying expensive clothing, all these days were done in a very simple manner, in such a way that the dignity of women is given to them, instead of doing as if we are purchasing the woman. No, because that aspect of giving the mahar, it reflects the pre-Islamic history, and also during the time of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, the mahar was to be given as a gift, but also it could be symbolic. It could be symbolic, other than forcing the family to pay that huge amount, and which at the end of the day scare young people from getting married. And that is why they themselves have to put into practice.
Thank you very much. This session, where we can exchange ideas, questions, and comments, will continue for another 15 minutes. They will leave the session open. If you have to go, that's fine. I myself have to go in order to rejoin my brothers on retreat. I do want to thank our speakers, Dr. Greeley, Dr. Wullobayi, and Dr. Arslan, whom I hope to see in Istanbul soon, inshallah. And thank you all for your questions and comments. Please continue the conversation as you would like. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have actually an anecdote I would like to share with, especially that relates to Dr. Greeley's presentation, if that's okay. Very briefly. It's a Sufi anecdote.
Okay.
It is said that Junaid Baghdadi, you know, a major early Sufi scholar, he met with other Sufis, and they approach him and they say, or he asked them, so what do you do when you find something? What is your practice? And they say, well, when we find provision, we show thanks to God. And when we don't find anything, then we show patience. And Junaid says, well, that is what the dogs of Baghdad do also. And they ask, so what do you do? And he says, I say thanks when I can't find anything, and when I do find some provision, I give it away. So there is this, you know, multiple levels of engagement in, you know, that higher level of spirituality, I guess. But it's a similar message that al-Ghazali addresses.
I think so. And you know, it strikes me that, you know, and I think this goes back to something, I think Sandra maybe mentioned this, but there is a tradition in most religions, whether it's Abrahamic or Eastern religions, well, particularly Abrahamic, I think, there's sort of a love-hate with the mystics, you know, because the mystics sometimes offer us just such wisdom and spiritual guidance that's so profound and sometimes really difficult and counterintuitive and all those things, that sometimes they're kind of pushed aside, like, no, you're just too crazy, or you're just too different, or I can't go there, or that's, you know, that's a very select few. And so some traditions either, you know, say that these people are crazy, we don't want them at all. Some parts of tradition say we bring them in. I see them as enriching, and I do, you know, there is a way in which, if you look at some of the great mystics, I think Dr. Arslan mentioned Rumi, and then you have some of these other great mystics from other Christianity and Judaism as well. And when you start reading them all, and if you put away some of the language and the historicity, and they really are saying some of the exact same things, you know, they kind of transcend, not denying their faith, right? But they sort of also say, but then there's this other level at which we're all kind of we're all kind of converged together. And, you know, it's humbling to read them, I think, and it's humbling to think of them and forging their path. I mean, when Ghazali loses his ability to speak, and, you know, he's so caught up in his spiritual crisis, you know, it's remarkable, and yet he figures out a way to work with it. So, yeah.
I think this is really similar to in education and into a lot of our thinking fields where we talk about left brain and right brain, and we talk about them as exclusive areas. And we all know kind of the egghead who just sits with numbers and can't relate to people and can't talk. And then we know the person that's in Hebrew or Yiddish, there's a word lufmensch, the airhead, that, you know, his head is in the clouds, and, you know, he's talking these esoteric terms and can't balance his checkbook kind of thing. And I think that the issue for me is always one of balance. It was said during the presentations that we have those that are very tied to the ritual to the point that it becomes perfunctory. I think you said it, Dr. Greeley, that it becomes, you know, you just do it by rote. And this response to that is, that's not what that's supposed to be. That's not, I mean, if you go back to the Reformation in terms of the impetus of how much had of religious observance and practice become what was perceived to be calcified, and a lot of our new iterations of our respective religious traditions really call us to task for that. So I think part of it is the authority structure. You know, you have this authority structure that wants to maintain itself for whatever reasons. Don't make me think too much. Don't make me look into it too much, because then I might question. And I think what mystics bring to us is a really important sense of accountability and of thinking about oneself. And also, again, I always say this, reducing hubris, the idea that we are all answerable, accountable, part of something much larger than ourselves. And that becomes really threatening to people who become so wedded to these, rote actions that they feel that they can control. And I also think to Dr. I know I'm going to get the wrong, Wullobayi's point, I think that's a big issue of the male-female dynamic as well. There's this whole thing in the Jewish academic tradition where men wanted to keep the women out of the study halls because they were afraid of the nuance and of the intentionality we would bring to the table, and it would challenge. It's much easier to just keep doing the rituals, don't think about why we're doing anything. So I think that's I think part of what the problem is out there with so much of what's going on in the world right now. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that it makes us better by making us smaller.
Judge Epstein, I was going to say, it's not just in Judaism that women were kept out. I think actually universally women have been kept out until recently.
For sure.
No one faith, I think it's but
I opportunity
right.
Discrimination, yeah.
I think your idea of accountability is really so spot on, because the mystics by and large are very wedded, they're very involved with their faith traditions. They engage in the ritual practices, I'm sure. I can't speak for obviously times gone by, but there's never a sense that any of the mystics have denied whatever the performative or active participation of the faith. But as you said, they rise beyond, they sort of begin there, but then they rise above it. And your idea of it, of the mystics bringing, sort of working against the hubris and sort of saying to us, we might have one of the answers. Isn't there a famous Sufi tradition? There's I'm trying to remember, but the idea of the elephant and what side of the elephant we're all touching. And we think we have the answer. The elephant is the tail, the elephant is the trunk, the elephant is, but it's really the whole thing together. And the mystics kind of say, we've got to move beyond those boundaries and rise above it, which is, as you said, very difficult, because I think they're vested interests, power interests in keeping things the way they are, which is, I don't know how we break those walls down. Maybe that's what the political scientists will have to help us with.
Well, I think it's going to be, it has to be an integrated process. I think Dr. The second presenter,
Arslan.
Arslan was, when the idea that we do need to look at what are we teaching? How are we schooling the next generation? To what degree are we holding on to old truths, but not accommodating new challenges that make us not change those truths? But this is not the first time in history this has happened. How was that accommodated? How did we move beyond those challenges? And I think what Dr. Wullobayi gave us was a very good example of how do we use these traditions and our history and maintain our identity and respond to the issues that are confronting us today.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The Tao Te Ching says that a person who's secure is a person who's confident, and insecure people are intolerant. So security, knowing who you are, gives you the foundation to be tolerant of others. Insecure people are intolerant people. So when you see intolerance, what you're seeing is insecurity. And that was actually a concern I had with the discussion about this categorical way of thinking about the world in terms of tradition and modernity, because I find that a very troubling and unhelpful way to make us different and better than them. Now, that may reflect that individual's, her own journey, I hate that term, but her own experience, which is a valid way of thinking about that, and the context that she's in. But the larger idea of disregarding secularity and disregarding voices who have already rejected categories, and they may not be rejecting wisdom, They may not be rejecting virtue. You know, when you talk about post-modernity, you know, you're being dismissive of, say, Derrida or someone who's very validly and genuinely committed to a life of virtue and a life of morality, although maybe using different mores or different wisdom categories. But I think that's, to me, you know, we're kind of making general comments about mysticism here. And I think one of the general comments that could be made is it's proactive and not anti. It's not criticizing what isn't happening, but affirming what can happen, looking beyond the category and the label.
I think you're right. And I think the friendly amendment I would make to that is that we're never dealing with pure and isolated categories. We're always dealing with Venn diagrams. And I think part of the reason that she began with her personal journey was to qualify that this was the context in which she came to. She did feel that there's a certain intransigence in Turkey. We know what's going on, guys. And within that political framework, your religious identity almost gets hijacked. And we're all seeing this. I mean, I'm seeing this in a very personal way in Israel with what's going on, where everybody's talking about it's Netanyahu is all of Israel and the extremists of Hamas are all of Palestinians. And my work is to sit with Palestinians and Israelis and cry together, laugh together, share our food, share our, you know, you have to get past the ones who are the power keepers in terms of maintaining that. I suspect that as she goes through her journey, she will come to that place. And I don't think that the duality that she presented is as absolute as it may have come across, I suspect. I don't know, but we're going to be in contact, so I'll find out.
Yeah, and if it is her journey, if it is her experience, then it's valid. I mean, the fact is that for those of us who teach Nietzsche, we know that there is a certain intransigence even in the secular, but to the point that, I'm sorry, Mr. Van Gogh, Dr. Van Gogh made, yeah, I think it's trying to find places of intersection. You know, can the critical thinking of the whatever, I think she meant modernity or something, you know, the critical thinking of that, can that feed into the religious traditions and this idea of, you know, having a conversation or finding points of intersection, points of disagreement, learning how, you know, and still having the conversations and seeing if there are places where we can, you know, something you said about, you know, taking the next step up and then moving beyond that. You know, it's an ongoing struggle, I think. But I think you're right, Dr. Epstein, this idea of the extremes somehow getting all the voice. Look at the United States. I mean,
oh my God.
For those of us of the Christian persuasion, I'm sorry, but there were just some people you wish didn't have access to the internet. You know what I mean?
We all have those players that we'd rather not have.
Yeah, yeah.
Also, another
it's being about for, you know, being for and not against. That's
exactly.
That, and I think when we try to be against modernity and against this and against that, I mean, you referenced Turkey. The actual part of the actual problem there is this: I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, to use the Christian term, or to use, you know, I'm of the Mevlana, and I'm, you know, anti-Sufi.
Right.
Ideas. And it's just very categorical, and it just erases any kind of meaningful dialogue, as opposed to creating and generating interesting and provocative questions and conversations.
And I think also, Dr. Van Gorder, if we go back to Dr. Wullobayi's presentation again, which I found so interesting, in that I do deal in the Jewish community with what we call agunot. According to Jewish law, only a man can institute a divorce. So if a woman wants to divorce, and if a woman's in an abusive marriage, there are these specific teachings that are taken out of context by people who are in authority, and they say, no, you can't have a divorce. But if you really, fine, I'll give you a divorce, but then I'm going to choose the spouse and write a contract now for our 3-year-old daughter. And there's all this stuff going on in the Jewish community today. And I deal with this. I take women to the rabbinic court and I advocate for them so that they can get a divorce and not be in that situation. this is not the first time this has happened. If you go back in history, there are definitely precedents for how you deal with this abuse. So I think sometimes, to add to what you're saying, is it's not just looking at modernity because of the chains of the past, but it's looking back in the past to see how did we release ourselves from those chains then. And that's where I think the for or against thing kind of fades away. Let's implement these mechanisms that we've used.
And you know, in this conference, we're all playing Rumi bingo. So I'll Rumi quote here. Rumi, you know, he has this great quote where there's this drunken Christian who confronts him. And he basically says to that Christian, the Christian asks him, which religion is true, yours or mine? And Rumi says, yours, because the larger point isn't going to be won with these kinds of entrenched legal factors. And yet at the same time, as you're saying, Dr. Epstein, we live with these ropes. We have ropes, but when we get a chance, we should let the ropes go. But you're right. Sometimes people are caught in ropes and we have to deal with what we have to deal with. So transcending doesn't give us permission to not help women caught in these unjust or unhealthy experiences. That's the ropes that have to be cut. And sometimes that's a gentle, long-term, gradual process.